It may be an error to speak of a chosen people, but it is not a mistake to speak of a chosen individual. By 3,000 years before Christ, the concept of God had grown very hazy in the minds of men. Revealed truth was threatened with extinction. The races of Earth were advancing in intellect and losing ground in spirit. And so, 1973 years before the birth of Jesus, an emergency son of the local universe did what had been done only 6 times in all the history of Nebadon. Machiventa Melchizedek personalized on Earth as a temporary man of the realm, near what was to become the city of Salem in Palestine. But why Palestine? Why not Egypt, China, India, or the northern tribes? The answer, in part, was a family. For generations, the Melchizedek receivers had been observing the ancestors of a man named Terah, confidently expecting offspring in a certain generation who would be characterized by intelligence, initiative, sagacity, and sincerity. The children of Terah met those expectations in every way. It was this possibility of contact with the versatile children of Terah that had much to do with the appearance of Machiventa at Salem. There were other families on Earth just as well prepared, among the red races, the yellow races, the Andites of the west and north. But no other land was so favorably situated for the later appearance of Michael as the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, centrally placed at the crossroads of the trade, travel, and civilization of the world. One of Terah's sons was named Abram.
The story does not begin with a voice from heaven. It begins with a preacher. In the city of Ur of Chaldea, a Phoenician teacher named Ovid proclaimed the doctrines of Salem. Terah and his whole family became half-hearted converts. They left Ur, intending to travel directly through to Salem. But Nahor, Abram's brother, had never seen Melchizedek. He was lukewarm, and he persuaded the family to tarry at Haran. And long after they finally reached Palestine, they were still unwilling to destroy all the household gods they had carried with them. They were slow to give up the many gods of Mesopotamia for the one God of Salem. A few weeks after Terah died, Melchizedek sent one of his students, Jerem the Hittite, with an invitation to both brothers. "Come to Salem, where you shall hear our teachings of the truth of the eternal Creator, and in the enlightened offspring of you two brothers shall all the world be blessed."
Nahor had not wholly accepted the gospel. He remained behind and built a strong city-state bearing his own name. But Abraham went, and Lot, his nephew, went with him. Arriving at Salem, Abraham and Lot chose a hilly stronghold near the city, defensible against the surprise raids of Hittites, Assyrians, and Philistines, who constantly harried central and southern Palestine. From that fastness in the hills, they made frequent pilgrimages to Salem. 3 separate times, Abraham attended the Salem school, and in time, this half-hearted convert from Ur became one of Melchizedek's most brilliant pupils and chief supporters.
Drought came to Palestine. Abraham and Lot journeyed down to the valley of the Nile for food, and there, in Egypt, Abraham found a distant relative seated on the Egyptian throne. He served this king as commander of 2 highly successful military expeditions. During the latter part of his sojourn, he and his wife Sarah lived at court, and when he departed Egypt, he carried with him a share of the spoils of his campaigns. It required great determination to turn away from the honors of the Egyptian court, but Melchizedek was revered even in Egypt, and when the full story was laid before Pharaoh, the king himself strongly urged Abraham to return to his vows to the cause of Salem. Abraham returned, but he returned with kingly ambitions burning in him. On the road back, he laid before Lot a plan to subdue all Canaan and bring its peoples under the rule of Salem. Lot wanted commerce, not conquest. After a later disagreement, he departed for Sodom to trade in goods and herds. Abraham matured his military projects. He was soon recognized as civil ruler of the Salem territory, and he confederated 7 nearby tribes under his leadership. It was with great difficulty that Melchizedek restrained him, for Abraham was fired with a zeal to round up the neighboring tribes with the sword, that they might the more quickly be brought to the knowledge of the Salem truths. Melchizedek was not militaristic. He kept peace with every surrounding tribe and was never attacked by any passing army. He would sanction a defensive policy for Salem, but he would not approve his pupils' schemes of conquest. And so there occurred a friendly severance of relationship. Abraham went over to Hebron and there established his military capital.
Because of his close connection with the illustrious Melchizedek, Abraham held a great advantage over the surrounding petty kings. They all revered Melchizedek, and they unduly feared Abraham. He knew of this fear, and he waited only for an excuse. The excuse came when certain rulers presumed to raid the property of Lot in Sodom. At the head of his 7 confederated tribes, Abraham moved on the enemy, his own bodyguard of 318 officering an army of more than 4,000 men. When Melchizedek heard that his former disciple had declared war, he went forth to dissuade him, but caught up with Abraham only as he returned victorious from the battle. Abraham insisted that the God of Salem had given him the victory, and he persisted in giving 1/10 of his spoils to the Salem treasury. The other 90% he removed to Hebron. And here, the record preserves an unflinching detail. After this victory over Chedorlaomer, Abraham did not feel quite at ease until he had offered a conventional sacrifice, the very practice the Salem colony forbade, the practice Melchizedek had labored to replace with the sacrament of bread and wine. Melchizedek never fully eradicated the proclivity to sacrifice from his followers, not even from Abraham. After Siddim, Abraham became leader of a second confederation, 11 tribes now. He paid tithes to Melchizedek and saw to it that everyone else in the vicinity did the same. The king of Sodom joined the Hebron Confederation. Abraham was well on his way to establishing a powerful state in Palestine. Abraham envisioned the conquest of all Canaan. Only one thing weakened his resolve. Melchizedek would not sanction it. And yet Abraham had nearly decided to proceed anyway, when a different worry began to gnaw at him. He had no son, no heir to rule this proposed kingdom. He arranged another conference with Melchizedek, and in the course of that interview, the priest of Salem, the visible Son of God, persuaded Abraham to abandon his scheme of material conquest and temporal rule in favor of the spiritual concept of the kingdom of heaven. Melchizedek explained the futility of contending with the Amorite confederation and made it equally clear that these backward clans were destroying themselves by their own foolish practices, so that within a few generations, Abraham's greatly multiplied descendants could easily overcome them. And Melchizedek made a formal covenant with Abraham at Salem. He said, "Look now up to the heavens and number the stars if you are able. So numerous shall your seed be." And Abraham believed Melchizedek, and it was counted to him for righteousness. And then Melchizedek told Abraham the story of the future occupation of Canaan by his offspring after their sojourn in Egypt. Hear what this covenant is. It represents the great Urantian agreement between divinity and humanity. God agrees to do everything. Man agrees only to believe God's promises and follow his instructions. Salvation had been thought purchasable only by works, by sacrifices and offerings. Now, Melchizedek brought again to this world the good news that favor with God is had by faith. It was too advanced for the age. The Semitic tribesmen would drift back to the old sacrifices, back to atonement by the shedding of blood. Even Abraham believed only half-heartedly, and even that was counted for righteousness. Not long after the covenant, Isaac was born, in accordance with the promise of Melchizedek. And after Isaac's birth, Abraham took a very solemn attitude toward his covenant. He went over to Salem to have it stated in writing, and at that public and formal acceptance, he changed his name from Abram to Abraham. He did one thing more. All his life, Abraham had opposed circumcision, a practice most Salem believers followed, though Melchizedek had never made it obligatory. Now, to solemnize the ratification of the covenant, Abraham formally accepted the rite he had always resisted. And it was after this real and public surrender of his personal ambitions, after the sword was laid down for good, that 3 celestial beings appeared to him on the plains of Mamre. This was an appearance of fact, though the record warns us the narratives later attached to it, concerning the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, were subsequently fabricated around what was in truth a natural destruction. With the covenant consummated, the reconciliation between Abraham and Melchizedek was complete. Abraham again assumed the civil and military leadership of the Salem colony, which at its height carried over 100,000 regular tithe payers on the rolls of the Melchizedek Brotherhood.
And here we meet Abraham the administrator. He greatly improved the Salem temple. He provided new tents for the entire school. He extended the tithing system, a system whose very idea descended from the traditions of the ancient Sethite priests of the Second Eden. He reorganized the business of the school, strengthened the Department of Missionary Propaganda, improved the herds, and rebuilt the Salem dairying projects. The record's verdict on the man is exact and unsentimental. A shrewd and efficient businessman, wealthy for his day, not overly pious, but thoroughly sincere. And he did believe in Machiventa Melchizedek. He wore the faith at his own depth. The 3 concentric circles on Melchizedek's breast, the Satania symbol of the Paradise Trinity, Abraham understood as the 3 most highs of Urantia, as he had been taught that the 3 functioned as one. And to Abraham, Melchizedek represented a God who would accept man on the simple terms of personal faith.
That covenant became the pattern for all the missionary propaganda that went out from Salem to the world. Shortly after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Machiventa decided to end his emergency bestowal. The tribes, even his closest associates, were beginning to regard him as a demigod, to reverence him with superstitious fear, and he wished to leave the scene of his earthly work long enough before Abraham's death to make certain the truth of the one and only God would stand firmly established in the minds of his followers. So one night, having said goodnight to his human companions, Machiventa retired to his tent at Salem, and in the morning, when they went to call him, he was not there, for his fellows had taken him. On the 3rd day after his disappearance, he stood again among his 11 fellow receivers, resuming his interrupted watch over this world. 94 years he had taught in the flesh. For Abraham, it was a great trial. The loss of Melchizedek produced a sadness in his heart that he never fully overcame. Hebron he had already abandoned when he gave up the ambition of a material kingdom. Now, having lost his associate in the building of the spiritual kingdom, he left Salem too, and went south to live near his interests at Gerar. And there the record shows us the man's oldest wound. Abraham became fearful and timid. He withheld his identity at Gerar so that Abimelech appropriated his wife. For shortly after his marriage to Sarah, Abraham had one night overheard a plot to murder him in order to take his brilliant wife, and that dread became a lifelong terror in an otherwise brave and daring leader. All his life, he feared that someone would kill him secretly for Sarah's sake. And this explains why, on 3 separate occasions, this brave man exhibited real cowardice. But Abraham was not long deterred in his mission as the successor of Melchizedek. Soon he made converts among the Philistines and among Abimelech's people. He made a treaty with them, and, in turn, was contaminated by many of their superstitions, particularly the practice of sacrificing firstborn sons. The record elsewhere lets us see that darkness plainly. The spectacle of Abraham constrained to sacrifice his son Isaac, while shocking to civilized sensibilities, was not a new or strange idea to the men of those days. It was long a prevalent practice for fathers, in times of great emotional stress, to sacrifice their firstborn sons. And yet, Abraham rose again. Thus did he become once more a great leader in Palestine, held in reverence by all groups, honored by all kings, the spiritual leader of all the surrounding tribes, his influence continuing for some time after his death. In the closing years of his life, he returned to Hebron, the scene of his earlier ambitions, the place where he had worked side by side with Melchizedek.
His last act was to send trusty servants to the city of his brother Nahor on the border of Mesopotamia to secure a woman of his own people as a wife for his son Isaac, for it had long been the custom of his people to marry their cousins. And Abraham died confident in that faith in God which he had learned from Melchizedek in the vanished schools of Salem. The revelators are direct about what happened to this story afterward. What the Old Testament records describe as conversations between Abraham and God were in reality conferences between Abraham and Melchizedek. Later scribes came to regard the very name Melchizedek as a synonym for God. The many recorded contacts of Abraham and Sarah with the angel of the Lord refer to their numerous visits with Melchizedek. Keturah was not a wife of Abraham. Like Hagar, she was a concubine, and all of Abraham's property went to Isaac, the son of Sarah, the status wife. Abraham was not so old as the records indicate, and his wife was much younger. These ages were deliberately altered to provide for the later claim of a miraculous birth of Isaac. During the Babylonian captivity, the national ego of the Jews, deeply depressed, swung to the extreme of national and racial egotism. The scribes carefully edited their records to raise Abraham and their national leaders above all other persons, not accepting Melchizedek himself. They destroyed every record of those momentous times they could find, preserving only the narrative of the meeting of Abraham and Melchizedek after the Battle of Siddim, which they deemed reflected honor upon Abraham. And in losing sight of Melchizedek, they lost sight of his teaching about the promised bestowal son, so completely that few of their descendants were able or willing to recognize Michael when he came.
What survived? Isaac held fairly well to his father's teachings and nourished the gospel of the Salem colony. Jacob found it harder to grasp the significance of these traditions. Joseph was a firm believer in Melchizedek, and largely for that reason, his brothers called him a dreamer. In Egypt, Joseph's honor was chiefly due to the memory of his great-grandfather Abraham, and though offered military command of the armies of Egypt, he chose instead to serve as a civil administrator, believing he could thus better labor for the advancement of the kingdom of heaven. The progeny of Abraham through Isaac, as intermarried with the Kenites, were the only line which long continued to nourish any clear concept of the Salem teachings.
And the verdict of the revelation is sweeping. Factually, the Hebrew religion is predicated upon the covenant between Abraham and Machiventa Melchizedek. Without the teaching of Machiventa to Abraham and his contemporaries, the Hebrews would have come out of Egypt in hopeless darkness. Michael could hardly come to Urantia until there existed a people believing in the universal Father among whom he could appear.
So the line runs unbroken from a tent in Chaldea where a herder named Amdon first heard the words, "I am Melchizedek, priest of El Elyon, the Most High, the one and only God," through a caravan out of Ur, through a warlord who laid down the conquest of Canaan for a covenant written in stars, through Isaac and the Kenites and Moses and the prophets with whom Machiventa continued to collaborate through 19 centuries, until the night the son of that same universal Father was born of a woman, exactly as the sage of Salem had foretold.